I'm now beginning chapter 9, called The Ideal, the Individual, Religion, Science, and the Law. The ideal, the individual, religion, science, and the law. That is the heading for our next chapter. What is the law? Why do you have law? Law are laws. Why do you have laws? You may follow it with that. Are laws made to protect life, to protect property, to establish order, to punish transgressors? Are laws made to protect man from his own cunning and chicanery? In short, are laws made to protect man from his own basically criminal nature? Are laws made to protect man from the self, as it is generally outlined by Freud and Darwin? Man had laws, however, far earlier. Are laws made then to protect man from his sinful nature? If you were all perfect beings, would you need laws at all? Do laws define what is unacceptable, or do they hint of some perhaps undifferentiated, barely sensed, more positive issues? Are laws an attempt to limit impulses? Do they represent society's mass definitions of what behavior is acceptable and what is not? What is the difference between a crime and a sin, as most of you think of those things? In a state you punish for a sin, they mess up the writing. You punish for a sin, can you punish for a crime? Is the law a reflection of something else, a reflection of man's inherent search toward the ideal and its actualization? When does the law act as a practical idealist? Why do you sneer so when politicians show their feet of clay? How does this concern you as an individual? We will start with the individual. Each individual is innately driven by good intent, however distorted that intent may become, or however twisted the means that may be taken to achieve it. As the body wants to grow from childhood's own, so all of the personality's abilities want to grow and develop. Each person has his or her own ideas and impulses, and impulses direct those ideas naturally into their own specific avenues of development, avenues meant to fulfill both the individual and his society. Impulses provide specifications, methods, meanings, definitions. They point toward definite avenues of expression, avenues that will provide the individual with a sense of actualization, natural power, and that will automatically provide feedback so that the person knows he is impressing his environment for the better. Those natural impulses followed will automatically lead to political and social organizations that become both tools for individual development and implements for the fulfillment of the society. Impulses then would follow easily in a smooth motion from private action to social import. When you are taught to block your impulses and to distrust them, then your organizations become clogged. You are left with vague, idealized feelings of wanting to change the world for the better, for example. But you are denied the personal power of your own impulses that would otherwise help direct that idealism by developing your personal abilities. You are left with an undefined, persisting, even tormenting desire to do good, to change events, but without having any means at your disposal to do so. This leads to lingering frustration, and if your ideas are strong, the situation can cause you to feel quite desperate. You may begin to exaggerate the gulf between this generalized ideal and the specific evidences of man's greed and corruption that you see so obviously about you. You may begin to concentrate upon your own lacks, and in your growing sense of dissatisfaction, It may seem to you that most men are driven by a complete lack of good intent. You may become outraged, scandalized, or worse, filled with self-righteousness, so that you begin to attack all those with whom you do not agree, because you do not know how else to respond to your own ideas or to your own good intent. The job of trying to make the world better seems impossible, or it appears that you have no power, and any small private beneficial actions that you can take seem so puny in contrast to this generalized ideal that you dismiss them sardonically, and so you do not try to use your own power constructively. You do not begin with your own life, with your own job, or with your own associates. What difference can it make to the world if you are a better salesperson or a better plumber or office worker or car salesman? For Christ's sakes, what can one person do? Yet that is precisely where first of all you must begin to exert yourself. There on your jobs and in your associations are the places where you intersect with the world. Your impulses directly affect the world in those relationships. Many of you are convinced that you are not important, and while each of you feels that way, it will seem that your actions have no effect upon the world. You will purposefully keep your ideas generalized, thus saving yourself from the necessity of acting upon them in the one way open to you, by trusting yourself and your impulses, and impressing those that you meet in daily life with the full validity that is your own. Most criminals act out of a sense of despair. Many have high ideas, but ideas that have never been trusted or acted upon. They feel powerless, so that many strike out in self-righteous anger or vengeance against a world that they see as cynical, greedy, and perverted. They have concentrated upon the great gaps that seem to exist between their ideals of what man should be and their ideals of what man is. On the one hand, they believe that the self is evil, and on the other, they are convinced that the self should not be so. They react extravagantly. They often see society as the enemy of good. Many, not all, now criminals possess the same characteristics you ascribe to heroes, except that the heroes have a means toward the expression of idealism and specific avenues for that expression. And many criminals find such avenues cut off completely. I do not want to romanticize criminals or justify their actions. I do want to point out that few crimes are committed for evil's sake, but in a distorted response to the failure of the actualization of a sensed ideal. So we return to what is the nature of the ideal and the good. Who defines what is right and wrong, legal and illegal? End of session, and a fond good evening. Thank you very much. Jane's delivery had often been fast and impassioned, even with the indicated pauses. She began to slow up toward session's end, though. There's much more, but I got so I couldn't get it, she said, referring to her very relaxed state, which she still enjoyed. But I feel this generalized material. Then Seth zeroes in on it specifically. I think that the session tonight was one of those concentrated ones where you get a lot in a short time. I told her she had done well. Notes on session 860. Jane originated the key portion of the new title early last Sunday morning when she got up at 4 a.m. to have breakfast and make some notes for her book. Through the open patio door, she listened to the first bird calls, summoning her outside to watch the foggy dawn unfold. She was entranced. No one else was watching what I watched from my personal viewpoint that morning. She wrote an hour later, I felt as if I were being privileged to view a beginning of the world, or of my edge of it. Or I thought suddenly it was like seeing a new corner of your own psyche, transformed into trees, grass, flowers, sky, and fog. I felt as if I were viewing that part of myself that I'm always pursuing, the part that is as clear-eyed for a child, fleet, at one with its own knowing. That part of us exists from our concerns about careers or business, money, fame, an opinion of family, friends, or the world. It's our direct connection with the universe from which we emerge in each moment of our lives. So in that moment, I named that part of me the God of Jane. And that designation makes sense to me, at least. In those terms, we each have our personal God. And I am convinced that the universe knows no matter who or where or what we are. I think there is a God of Mitzi and a God of Billy for each of our cats, and that each consciousness, regardless of its status, possesses this intimate connection with the universe. Okay, session 862. Jane and I have had two most pleasant surprises since Seth gave the 860th session. We expected both events, but not so soon. On the 14th, we received from Prentice Hall our complimentary copies just off the press of Seth Psyche. Then, on the 18th, we received Volume 2 of Unknown Reality. Volume 2 will be marketed a few weeks in it. I'm going to skip down through this because he's talking about non-essential to this things briefly. Okay, dictation. The law in your country says that you are innocent until proven guilty. In the eyes of that law, then, you are each innocent until a crime is proven against you. There usually must also be witnesses. There are other considerations. Often a spouse cannot testify against the other. Opportunity and motive must also be established. In the world of religion, however, you are already tainted by original sin. The mark of Cain is symbolically upon your foreheads. You come from a species that sinned against God. Automatically condemned, you must do good works, or be baptized, or believe in Christ, or perform other acts in order to be saved or redeemed. According to other religions, you may be earthbound by the gross desires of your nature, bound to the wheel of life, condemned to endless reincarnations, until you are purified. As I have said before, according to psychology and science, you are a living conglomeration of elements and chemicals spawned by a universe without purpose, itself accidentally formed, and you are given a life in which all of the primitive and animalistic drives of your evolutionary past ever lurk within you, awaiting expression and undermining your control. So, dear reader, look at the law as it stands in this country with somewhat more kindly eyes than you have before, for it at least legally establishes a belief in your innocence, and for all of its failings, it protects you from the far more fanatical aspects, say, of any religion's laws. Religious laws deal with sin, whether or not a crime is committed, and religious concepts usually take it for granted that the individual is guilty until proven innocent. And if you have not committed a crime, in fact, then you have at least sinned in your heart, for which, of course, you must be punished. A sin can be anything, from playing cards to having a sexual fantasy. You are sinful creatures. How many of you believe that? You were born with an inbuilt recognition of your own goodness. You were born with an inner recognition of your tightness in the universe. You were born with a desire to fulfill your abilities to move and act in the world. Those assumptions are the basis of what I will call natural law. You are born loving. You are born compassionate. You are born curious about yourself and your world. Those attributes also belong to natural law. You are born knowing that you possess a unique, intimate sense of being that is itself and that seeks its own fulfillment and the fulfillment of others. You are born seeking the actualization of the ideal. You are born seeking to add value to the quality of life, to add characteristics, energies, abilities to life that only you can individually contribute to the world, and to attain a state of being that is uniquely yours, while adding to the value fulfillment of the world. All of these qualities and attributes are given you by natural law. You are a cooperative species, and you are a loving one. Your misunderstandings, your crimes, and your atrocities, real as they are seldom committed out of any intent to be evil, but because of severe misinterpretations about the nature of good and the means that can be taken toward its actualization. Most individual people know that in some inner portion of themselves, your societies, governments, educational systems are all built around a firm belief in the unreliability of human nature. You cannot change human nature. Such a statement takes it for granted that man's nature is to be greedy, a predator, a murderer at heart. You act in accordance with your own beliefs. You become the selves that you think you are. Your individual beliefs become the beliefs of your society, but that is always a give and take. Shortly, we will begin to discuss the formation of a better kind of mass reality, a reality that can happen as more and more individuals begin to come in contact with the true nature of the self. Then we will have less frightened people and fewer fanatics, and each person involved can to some extent begin to see the ideal come into practical actualization. The means never justifies the ends. End of session. A fond good evening, and my hurrahs to Rupert and Jane. He's doing very well. Anyway, let me get on. Jane said that in his dictation this evening, Seth covered some of the information she'd picked up from him non-verbally, then written out prior to the session that wasn't held last Wednesday night. But there's also more there he didn't get into yet. Notes on session 862. Just before giving the 861st session last week, Jane received from Seth some intriguing material on the ideal that in psychological therapy, the good intents and impulses beneath the client's emotional and physical hassles should be searched out by the analyst. She made some notes about the information. It was very promising material, she told me, and could help change conventional ideals of therapy. A book could actually be involved. Seth's next on the therapy of value fulfillment. She was quite excited by the new ideas she'd presented herself with. Then in the 861st session, which was not for mass events, as stated, Seth briefly mentioned the material on ideals and impulses he'd been giving in recent book sessions. This in turn led him to a comment on the notes Jane had just written. He certainly sounded as though he had decided upon his next book. The therapy of value fulfillment will attempt to put individuals in touch with their basic instincts, to allow them to sense the impulsive shapes of their lives, to define their own versions of the ideal through the recognition of it as it exists in their own impulses and feelings and abilities, and to help them find acceptable and practical methods of exerting their natural power in the practical actualization of those ideas. Session 863. In my introductory notes for Volume 1 of Unknown Realities, I explained how Jane acknowledges the mail we get from our readers by sending them copies of letters from Seth and herself. To the latter, she adds a few personal lines for each correspondent. She also encloses a list of her books, which many readers ask for. Seth dictated his letter in April 1975, just after finishing his part on the work of Volume 2 of Unknown, and I presented it while introducing Volume 1. Jane still handles most of the mail herself, and she continues to send people Seth's letters because she still thinks he presented excellent ideas in it. In those notes, I also refer to an earlier letter that Seth had dictated for readers in January 1973. Jane and I suggested then, as we do now, that when possible the two Seth letters be read together since they complement each other so well. I'm going to go right down to the beginning of dictation. Good evening. Good evening, Seth. Dictation. When I speak of natural law, I am not referring to the scientist law of nature, such as the law of gravity, for example, which is not a law at all, but a manifestation appearing from the viewpoint of a certain level of consciousness as a result of perceptive apparatus. Your prejudiced perception is also built into your instruments in that regard. I am speaking of the inner laws of nature that pervade existence. What you call nature refers, of course, to your particular experience with reality, but quite different kinds of manifestations are also natural outside of that context. The law of nature that I am in the process of explaining underlie all realities, then, and form a firm basis for multitudinous kinds of natures. I will put these in your terms of reference, however. Each being experiences life as if it were at life's center. This applies to a spider in a closet as well as to any man or woman. This principle applies to each atom as well. Each manifestation of consciousness comes into being feeling secure at life's center, experiencing itself through itself, aware of life through its own nature. It comes into being with an inner impetus toward value fulfillment. It is equipped with a feeling of safety, of security within its own environment with which it is fit to deal. It is given the impetus toward growth and action, and filled with the desire to impress its world. The term value fulfillment is very difficult to explain, but it is very important. Obviously, it deals with the development of values, not moral values, however, but values for which you really have no adequate words. Quite simply, these values have to do with increasing the quality of whatever life the being feels at its center. The quality of that life is not simply to be handed down or experienced, for example, but is to be creatively added to, multiplied, in a way that has nothing to do with quantity. In those terms, animals have values, and if the quality of their lives disintegrates beyond a certain point, the species dwindles. We are not speaking of survival of the fittest, but the survival of life with meaning. Life is meaning for animals. The two are indistinguishable. You say little, for example, if you note that spiders make webs instinctively because spiders must eat insects, and that the best web makers will be the fittest kind of spider to survive. It is very difficult for me to escape the sticky web of your beliefs. The web, however, in its way, represents an actualized ideal on the spider's part, and if you will forgive the term, an artistic one as well. It amazes the spiders that flies so kindly fall into those webs. You might say that the spider wonders that art can be so practical. What about the poor unsuspecting fly? Is it then so enamored of the spider's web that it loses all sense of caution? For surely flies are the victims of such nefarious webby splendors. We are into sticky stuff indeed. For one thing, you are dealing with different kinds of consciousness than your own. They are focused consciousnesses, surely each one feeling itself at life's center. While this is the case, however, these other forms of consciousness also identify then with the source of nature from which they emerge. In a way, it's impossible to explain. The fly and spider are connected and aware of the connection, not as hunter and prey, but as individual participants in deeper processes. Together they work toward a joint kind of value fulfillment in which both are fulfilled. There are communions of consciousness of which you are unaware. While you believe in theories like the survival of the fittest, however, and the grand fantasies of evolution, Then you put together your perceptions of the world so that they seem to bear out those theories. You will see no value in the life of a mouse sacrificed in the laboratory, for example, and you will protect claw and fang battles in nature, completely missing the great cooperative venture that is involved. Men can become deranged if they believe life has no meaning. Religion has made gross errors. At least it held out an afterlife, a hope of salvation, and preserved, sometimes despite itself, the tradition of the heroic soul. Science, including psychology, by what it has said and by what it has neglected to say, has come close to a declaration that life itself is meaningless. This is a direct contradiction of deep biological knowledge, to say nothing of spiritual truth. It denies the meaning of biological integrity. It denies man the practical use of those very elements that he needs as a biological creature, the feeling that he is at life's center, that he can act safely in his environment, that he can trust himself, and that his being and his actions have meaning. Impulses provide life's guide to action. If you are taught that you cannot trust your impulses, then you are set against your very physical integrity. If you believe that your life has no meaning, then you will do anything to provide meaning, all the while acting like a mouse in one of science's mazes, for your prime directive, so to speak, has been tampered with. I am trying to temper my statements here, but your psychology of the past 50 years has helped create insanities by trying to reduce the great individual thrust of life that lies within each person to a generalized mass of chaotic impulses and chemicals, a mixture, again, of Freudian and Darwinian thought misapplied. The most private agonies of the soul were assigned a more or less common source in man's primitive unconscious drives. The private unquelled thrust toward creativity were seen as the unbalanced conglomeration of chemicals within a person's most private being, a twist of perversity. Genius was seen as a mistake of chromosomes or the fortunate result of a man's hatred for his father. The meaning of life was reduced to the accidental name of genes. Science thought in terms of averages and statistics, and each person was supposed to fit within those realms. To some extent, this also applies to religion in the same time period. Churches wanted sinners galore, but shied away from saints or any extravagant behavior that did not speak of man's duplicity. Suddenly, people with paranoidal characteristics as well as schizophrenics emerged from the wallpaper of this slickly styled civilization. The characteristics of each were duly noted. A person who feels that life has no meaning, and that his or her life in particular has no meaning, would rather be pursued than ignored. Even the weight of guilt is better than no feeling at all. If the paranoid might feel that he or she is pursued by the government or ungodly powers, then at least he feels that his life must be important. Otherwise, why would others seek to destroy it? If voices tell him he is to be destroyed, then these at least are comforting voices, for they convince him that his life must have value. At the same time, the paranoid person can use his creative abilities in fantasies that seemingly boggle the minds of the sane, and those creative abilities have a meaning, for the fantasies again serve to reassure the paranoid of his worth. If in your terms he were sane, he could not use his creative abilities, for they are always connected with life's meaning. And sane, the paranoid is convinced that life is meaningless. It did little good in the past for Freudian psychologists to listen to a person's associations while maintaining an objective air or pretending that values did not exist. Often the person labeled schizophrenic is so frightened of his or her own energy impulses and feelings, that these are fragmented, objectified, and seen to come from outside rather than from within. Ideas of good and evil are exaggerated, cut off from each other. Yet here again the creative abilities are allowed some expression. The person does not feel able to express them otherwise. Such people are afraid of the brunt of their own personality. They have been taught that energy is wrong, that power is disastrous, and that the impulses of the self are to be feared. What protection, then, but to effectively project these outside of the self, impulses of good as well as evil, and hence effectively block organized action? The term schizophrenia, with the authority of psychology, becomes a mass coverall in which the integrity of personal meaning is given a mass, generalized explanation. Those who are paranoid are, unfortunately, those who most firmly believe the worst idiosyncrasies of science and religion. Let me read that again. Those who are paranoid, unfortunately, those who most firmly believe the worst idiocies of science and religion. The paranoid and the schizophrenic are trying to find meaning in a world they have been taught is meaningless, and their tendencies appear in lesser form throughout society. Creativity is an inbuilt impetus in man, far more important than, say, what science calls the satisfaction of basic needs. In those terms, creativity is the most basic need of all. I am not speaking here of any obsessive need to find order, in which case, for example, a person might narrow his or her mental and physical environment, but of a powerful drive within the species for creativity and for the fulfillment of values that are emotional and spiritual. And if man does not find these, then the so-called basic drives toward food or shelter will not sustain him. I am not simply saying that man does not live for bread alone. I am saying that if man does not find meaning in life, he will not live, bread or no. He will not have the energy to seek the bread, nor trust his impulse to do so. There are natural laws, then, that guide all kinds of life, and all realities, laws of love and cooperation, and those are the basic needs of which I am speaking. End of session. Okay, good night. Now, that's weird, Jane said as soon as Seth withdrew. It's only 10:15, but I feel that what we got is way beyond in proportion to the time involved. Before the session, I knew he was going into schizophrenia and so forth, but he went past those inklings. Indeed, her delivery had often been intense and quite demanding as far as my writing speed went. Let's see, I have a little time on here. In recent weeks, Jane herself has been quite intrigued by the idea of personal centering, as she put in her notes for God of Jane. She also wants to study the subject for her book in connection with reincarnation, the origins of our species, and even of our world. She's already written several poems about her own view of reality. The one that follows charmed me as soon as she produced it. It'll probably end up in God of Jane, but I'd like to present it here too. No matter where I look. No matter where I look, I seem to be at the center of a world that forms perfectly around me. No lopsided vision ever shows the world spread only to my left, with my image on the last right edge. Nor has the world ever appeared just ahead, with nothingness, while nothingness began just behind my back. I sit in a swivel chair with smooth ball bearings. Without warning, I turn myself around in a complete circle, but nothing disturbs my world vision, and objects appear on all sides with sweet precision, as if a projector in my head sends out invisible rays that turn into images, so I always seem inside dimensions of depth and width and weight. I think that was meant to be width, depth and weight. Well, anyway, that was the poem. And I'm going to skip down to, well, you know, I think I'm going to end this session. We're at 35 minutes. And I'll begin anew. This is the Deaf Lady, over and out for now.